It began with a slow descent on a golden escalator. In June 2015, a real estate mogul and reality television star descended into the atrium of his own tower and declared his candidacy for the presidency of the United States. That moment, dismissed by many as a spectacle, shattered the established norms of American politics and set the stage for a presidency unlike any other in the nation's history. It was a hostile takeover of a political party and, eventually, the country's government. The promise was simple and direct: to put America first. Beyond the relentless headlines, the furious tweets, and the political firestorms, what did Donald Trump actually do? This is the central question that cuts through the noise. It is a question not of personality, but of policy, not of rhetoric, but of results. To answer it requires setting aside preconceived notions and looking squarely at the actions taken, the laws signed, and the institutions reshaped. His agenda was a blueprint for disruption, aimed squarely at the pillars of the post-Cold War consensus: globalized trade, established alliances, and a domestic regulatory framework that had grown for decades. He pledged to slash taxes, tear up trade deals, appoint conservative judges, build a wall, and pull back from the world stage. His supporters saw a long overdue course correction, a leader finally willing to speak for forgotten Americans. His critics saw a reckless assault on the foundations of the economy, democratic institutions, and the global order. This book will not tell you what to think. It will show you what happened. It will lay out the actions, the numbers, and the policies that defined one of the most transformative and turbulent periods in modern American life. To begin to understand the scope of this transformation, we must start in the engine room of his agenda: the American economy. Chapter 1: The America First Economy, Unpacking the Promises of Prosperity. We will have the biggest tax cut in the history of our country. It was a promise that resonated with millions of Americans who felt left behind by a globalizing economy. The core of Donald Trump's pitch was a return to a golden age of American manufacturing and middle-class prosperity, powered by a simple, two-pronged strategy: cutting taxes at home and renegotiating trade deals abroad. But what did this grand economic experiment look like in practice, and what did it cost? The centerpiece of this vision arrived in December 2017 with the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, TCJA. It was the most significant overhaul of the U.S. tax code in over 3 decades. The law's headline feature was a dramatic and permanent reduction in the corporate tax rate, from 35%, one of the highest in the developed world, down to 21%. The theory was that this would make the United States a more attractive place for businesses to invest, expand, and hire, while encouraging companies to bring home trillions of dollars held overseas. For individuals, the changes were more modest and temporary. The TCJA lowered income tax rates across most brackets, with the top rate falling from 39.6% to 37%. To simplify filing for millions, it nearly doubled the standard deduction to $24,000 for a married couple. It also doubled the child tax credit. However, to help pay for the cuts, the law capped the popular deduction for state and local taxes, SALT, at $10,000, a move that disproportionately affected taxpayers in high-tax states. What were the results? The administration pointed to a series of positive economic indicators. In the years following the tax cuts, real gross domestic product, GDP, grew, and by September 2019, the unemployment rate had fallen to 3.5%, a 50-year low. Crucially, unemployment rates for African Americans and Hispanic Americans reached the lowest levels on record. Proponents argued this was direct proof that lower taxes and a more business-friendly environment were creating a more inclusive prosperity. Indeed, more than 6 million workers received bonuses or wage increases that companies publicly attributed to the tax law. The second pillar of the America First economy was a frontal assault on long-standing trade agreements. Trump famously called the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, the worst trade deal maybe ever signed anywhere. He initiated a contentious renegotiation with Canada and Mexico, which culminated in the new United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. The USMCA included stronger protections for American auto workers, requiring that 75% of a vehicle's components be manufactured in North America to qualify for zero tariffs, up from 62.5% under NAFTA. It also opened Canadian markets to more U.S. dairy, poultry, and egg products. The more disruptive front in the trade war was with China. Accusing Beijing of unfair trade practices and intellectual property theft, the Trump administration imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. The move was designed to make American products more competitive and force China to change its economic behavior. China immediately retaliated with its own tariffs, leading to a tit-for-tat conflict that shook global supply chains and created uncertainty for American farmers and manufacturers who relied on Chinese markets. Eventually, a Phase 1 trade deal was signed in January 2020, in which China committed to increasing its purchases of American goods and services. This economic doctrine continued into his second term. A sweeping piece of legislation, dubbed the One Big, Beautiful Bill, was signed into law, delivering another round of tax relief while also boosting spending on immigration enforcement and the military. This approach, combining populist tax cuts with robust spending on nationalist priorities, was the very essence of Trump's economic vision. Yet, critics point to the staggering cost of these policies. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was projected to add well over $1.5 trillion to the national debt over a decade. The economic growth it spurred, they argue, was a continuation of trends that began during the previous administration and was not substantial enough to pay for the deep cuts in revenue. The trade wars, while popular with some domestic industries, led to higher costs for American consumers and hardship for others, particularly farmers targeted by retaliatory tariffs. Rebuilding the American economy was one foundational pillar of his platform. The second, and arguably more iconic, was controlling who gets to participate in it. To fully understand the America First agenda, we must turn from the ledger books to the nation's borders. Chapter 2. Redrawing the Lines. The Fight Over America's Borders. A four-word chant became the symbol of a movement and the shorthand for a presidency: build the wall. But the reality of Donald Trump's immigration policy was far more complex and far-reaching than a single structure of steel and concrete. It was a top-to-bottom overhaul of the nation's approach to immigration, shifting the focus decisively toward enforcement, restriction, and the physical hardening of the nation's frontiers. What did this effort to redraw the lines of America truly entail? From his first days in office, Trump used the full force of his executive power to reshape immigration. One of his earliest and most controversial actions was an executive order temporarily banning entry from several Muslim-majority countries, a move that sparked chaos at airports, widespread protests, and a flurry of legal challenges that ultimately reached the Supreme Court. The administration also moved to fulfill its signature campaign promise. After a protracted political battle that included the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, Trump declared a national emergency at the southern border, allowing him to divert billions of dollars from the military to wall construction. By the end of his first term, his administration had overseen the construction of approximately 450 miles of border barrier, much of it replacing older, less formidable fencing. The administration's policies went far beyond the physical wall. It implemented a zero-tolerance policy for illegal border crossings in 2018, which led to the systematic separation of thousands of migrant children from their parents. The public outcry over images of children in cages forced the president to formally end the practice, but the logistical and human challenge of reuniting families would linger for years. Simultaneously, the administration worked to dismantle programs that provided legal status to immigrants. It announced its intention to end the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals (DACA) program, which protected hundreds of thousands of young immigrants brought to the U.S. as children, plunging their futures into uncertainty until the Supreme Court blocked the immediate rescission. Furthermore, policies like the Remain in Mexico program, formerly known as the Migrant Protection Protocols, required tens of thousands of asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their cases were processed in U.S. courts, creating dangerous and squalid conditions in border towns. This enforcement-first approach was supercharged in his second term. Building on the foundation of the first, the administration secured a massive increase in funding, over $160 billion, for the Department of Homeland Security. This budget was explicitly designed to fund a mass deportation operation, with billions allocated to expand the network of immigrant detention facilities and hire thousands of additional ICE and Border Patrol agents. The goal, as one official stated, was to create a deportation system that could function like Amazon, trying to get your product delivered in 24 hours. Legislation like the Laken-Riley Act, named for a student tragically killed by an undocumented immigrant, became law, reflecting a continued focus on the criminal acts of individuals to justify broader enforcement policies. The administration also took the aggressive step of designating certain drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, unlocking new authorities to pursue them. The cost of legal immigration was also raised, with application fees for asylum and other forms of legal status increasing dramatically, placing new hurdles in front of those attempting to follow the rules. Supporters of these policies argue they were a necessary response to a border crisis that previous administrations had ignored. They point to periods of decreased illegal crossings as proof that a tough stance works, deterring migrants from making the dangerous journey north and re-establishing the rule of law. For them, these actions were a fulfillment of a core promise to protect the nation's sovereignty and prioritize the security of its citizens. Critics, however, describe the policies as a cruel and ineffective departure from American values. They argue that separating families, abandoning asylum seekers, and pursuing mass deportation inflicted needless trauma without addressing the root causes of migration. They contend that the focus on a physical wall was a costly and symbolic distraction, while the administrative changes created a system that was punitive, chaotic, and fundamentally unjust. While the physical borders of the nation were being hardened, Trump was orchestrating an equally profound and long-lasting transformation within America's institutions of power, a quiet revolution that began in the nation's courts. Chapter 3: The Judicial Revolution, Forging a Conservative Legacy in Black Robes. More than any single policy, any tax cut, or any trade deal, Donald Trump's most enduring legacy may be etched in the lifetime appointments he made to the federal judiciary. While headlines focused on the daily political dramas, a quiet and systematic revolution was underway. How did one president, in just one term, so decisively shift the ideological balance of the nation's highest court and the entire federal judiciary, ensuring his influence would be felt for a generation or more? The answer lies in a combination of political opportunity, strategic focus, and a partnership with a well-organized conservative legal movement. When Trump took office, there was an unusually high number of judicial vacancies, including a Supreme Court seat that Senate Republicans had held open for nearly a year following the death of Justice Antonin Scalia. Trump promised to fill these seats with conservatives who subscribed to the judicial philosophies of originalism and textualism, the ideas that judges should interpret the Constitution and laws according to their original meaning. His first and most consequential move was the nomination of Neil Gorsuch to fill Scalia's seat. The confirmation restored the court's previous ideological balance. But the true shift came with the retirement of Justice Anthony Kennedy, the court's pivotal swing vote. Trump's choice to replace him, Brett Kavanaugh, survived one of the most contentious and bitter confirmation battles in modern history to solidify a conservative majority. The transformation was completed following the death of liberal icon Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg just weeks before the 2020 election. Trump moved swiftly to nominate Amy Coney Barrett, a devout conservative, who was confirmed in record time. In just 4 years, the Supreme Court had been reshaped with a 6-3 conservative supermajority. This revolution extended far beyond the Supreme Court. While high-profile court battles captured public attention, the Trump administration, working in lockstep with the Senate, was confirming judges to the powerful circuit courts of appeals and district courts at a blistering pace. By the end of his first term, he had appointed over 220 federal judges. 1 out of every 4 circuit court judges in the nation was a Trump appointee. A key partner in this project was the Federalist Society, a conservative legal organization that effectively served as a screening and vetting pipeline for judicial nominees. This ensured a remarkable consistency in the ideological profile of the appointees. They were, on average, younger than the nominees of previous presidents, ensuring they would serve for decades, and they shared a common judicial philosophy that was skeptical of the power of federal agencies and committed to a more limited interpretation of federal power. The impact of this judicial revolution was immediate and profound. The new Supreme Court majority would go on to deliver landmark rulings on some of the most divisive issues in American life, from abortion rights and gun control to religious freedom and the regulatory power of the government. The effects cascaded down through the lower courts, where the newly appointed judges began to reshape American law from the ground up. For supporters, this was the crowning achievement of the Trump presidency. It was the fulfillment of a decades-long conservative goal to reclaim the judiciary from what they saw as liberal judicial activism. They celebrated the appointment of judges who, in their view, would simply interpret the law as written and not legislate from the bench, thereby returning power to the people and their elected representatives. For critics, the judicial appointments represented a grave threat to civil liberties and established precedents. They warned that the new judiciary was hostile to voting rights, environmental protection, workers' rights, and reproductive freedom. They saw the rapid-fire confirmations not as a restoration of balance, but as a partisan court-packing scheme designed to entrench a right-wing agenda for generations, regardless of the will of the electorate. This assertive reshaping of domestic institutions was mirrored by an equally dramatic disruption on the world stage. The post-war global order, built on a foundation of American leadership and alliances, was about to be tested as never before. Chapter 4: The Global Disruptor, Upending Alliances and Confronting Adversaries. We will no longer surrender this country, or its people, to the false song of globalism. With those words, delivered in his inaugural address, Donald Trump declared that the "America First" doctrine would not stop at the water's edge. For 70 years, American foreign policy had been built on a bipartisan consensus of international leadership, strong alliances, and free trade. Trump viewed this consensus as a bad deal, a system in which allies took advantage of American generosity and adversaries exploited its goodwill. His tenure was a deliberate effort to tear up the old playbook. What did this mean for America's friends and its enemies? The disruption began immediately. Within days of taking office, Trump formally withdrew the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, a massive 12-nation trade pact negotiated by the previous administration. He saw it as a job-killing disaster. Supporters of the deal saw it as a vital strategic tool to counter China's growing economic influence in Asia. This set the pattern for his approach, a preference for bilateral deals over multilateral agreements and a deep skepticism of international commitments. This skepticism soon led to more dramatic withdrawals. In 2017, he announced the U.S. would pull out of the Paris Agreement on climate change, arguing the accord placed an unfair economic burden on America. The following year, he withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, a landmark agreement between Iran and several world powers, reimposing crippling sanctions on Tehran and raising tensions in the Middle East. Later, in his second term, he would make good on threats to withdraw the United States from the World Health Organization, WHO, amid the fallout of a global pandemic. His relationship with America's oldest and closest allies was often fraught. He repeatedly chastised members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, for failing to meet their defense spending targets, suggesting that U.S. military protection was conditional. His approach was transactional, viewing alliances less as partnerships built on shared values and more as arrangements to be constantly evaluated for their cost and benefit to the United States. Conversely, he often displayed a willingness to engage directly with America's most entrenched adversaries. He became the first sitting U.S. president to meet with a North Korean leader, holding 3 summits with Kim Jong-un in an audacious but ultimately unsuccessful bid to achieve denuclearization. In the Middle East, he broke with decades of U.S. policy by formally recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and moving the American embassy there. While this move angered many in the Arab world, his administration also successfully brokered the Abraham Accords, a series of historic normalization agreements between Israel and several Arab nations, including the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. Yet, the region remained a tinderbox. During his second term, the U.S. became more directly involved in the escalating conflict between Israel and Iran, authorizing military strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities. The central drama of his foreign policy, however, was the relationship with China. He initiated a high-stakes trade war, imposing tariffs on billions of dollars of Chinese goods to combat what he called decades of unfair economic practices. After a period of escalating conflict that rattled global markets, a preliminary trade deal was reached. But the fundamental rivalry remained, with his second term seeing a renewed push through a new trade agreement that aimed to retain baseline tariffs and open Chinese markets further to American exports, while also collaborating on stemming the flow of fentanyl. Supporters championed this disruptive approach as a long overdue correction. They saw a president who was finally standing up for American interests, forcing allies to pay their fair share, and confronting adversaries like China head-on. In their view, he had replaced an era of managed decline with a foreign policy of strength and clarity. Critics saw a chaotic and incoherent strategy that undermined American credibility, alienated crucial allies, and created dangerous power vacuums around the world. They argued that by pulling out of international agreements and questioning the value of alliances, he had weakened the global order that the U.S. itself had built, ceding influence to rivals like China and Russia. The promise to disrupt the global order was part of a larger pledge to dismantle what supporters called the administrative state at home, the vast web of rules and regulations that govern American life and business. Chapter 5. The Deregulation Engine, Slashing Red Tape and Its Consequences. For every new regulation, 2 old regulations must be eliminated. It was a simple, powerful rule announced in the first weeks of the Trump presidency. This executive order was the opening salvo in a sustained war on the federal bureaucracy, an ambitious effort to unwind decades of government oversight in the name of unleashing economic growth. This was not just a policy preference, it was a core ideological belief that the administrative state had become a bloated, unaccountable fourth branch of government that stifled innovation and killed jobs. What happened when this deregulatory engine was fired up and aimed at Washington? The scale of the effort was immense. During his first term, the administration cut nearly 25,000 pages from the Federal Register, a proxy for the volume of federal rules. The stated goal was to save American households and businesses billions of dollars in compliance costs. This was achieved through a combination of repealing existing rules, halting the implementation of pending ones, and slowing the creation of new ones. The energy and environmental sectors were ground zero for this campaign. The administration systematically targeted regulations it viewed as burdensome to the fossil fuel industry. It replaced the Obama-era Clean Power Plan, which aimed to cut emissions from power plants, with the less stringent Affordable Clean Energy Rule. It withdrew and rewrote the Waters of the United States (WOTUS) rule, which had extended federal protection to smaller streams and wetlands, providing relief to farmers and developers who saw the rule as a massive government overreach. To achieve his goal of American energy dominance, Trump opened up vast new tracts of federal land and coastal waters to oil and gas drilling. The administration also moved to modernize the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, for the first time in over 40 years, implementing changes designed to streamline the review process and accelerate the approval of major infrastructure projects like pipelines and highways, cutting approval times from a decade or more down to 2 years. This philosophy was supercharged in his second term with the creation of a new task force, the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. Its mission was to aggressively cut federal spending and bureaucracy, leading to significant layoffs of civil servants. The war on the administrative state culminated in a truly audacious move, an executive order directing the closure of the U.S. Department of Education. While the order claimed essential functions like Pell Grants and funding for low-income schools would be maintained, it was a profound statement of the administration's belief in returning power from the federal government to state and local communities. Supporters hailed these actions as a liberation for the American economy. They argued that for too long, businesses had been suffocated by a thicket of nonsensical and costly regulations. By cutting this red tape, they contended, the administration was fostering a climate of innovation, encouraging investment, and ultimately creating jobs. For them, every repealed rule was a victory for freedom and a blow against an overbearing government. Critics, however, painted a darker picture. Environmental groups warned that the relentless rollback of regulations was a catastrophic abdication of the government's duty to protect public health and the environment. They argued that these actions would lead to more polluted air and water, accelerate the effects of climate change, and endanger wildlife. They saw the dismantling of the Department of Education not as a return of local control, but as an attack on public education and a threat to the enforcement of civil rights protections for vulnerable students. The debate crystallized a fundamental disagreement about the proper role of government itself. Trump's actions were not just about policy, they were a direct challenge to the very structure of government and the established norms of the presidency. This confrontational style inevitably led to unprecedented showdowns and constitutional tests of power. Chapter 6. The Crucible of Power, Impeachments, Investigations, and a Presidency Under Fire. It's a witch hunt. This was the constant, defiant refrain from Donald Trump in the face of a relentless storm of investigations that defined his presidency. But behind the heated rhetoric were formal, constitutional processes that put his conduct under the most intense scrutiny imaginable. These battles were not just political theater. They were a crucible that tested the limits of executive power, the resilience of democratic institutions, and the deep partisan divisions of the nation. What were the specific charges that led to Donald Trump becoming the only president in U.S. history to be impeached twice? The first impeachment ignited in the fall of 2019. It centered on a single phone call. An anonymous whistleblower revealed that President Trump had spoken with Ukraine's newly elected president, Volodymyr Zelensky, on July 25, 2019. In the call, Trump asked Zelensky to do us a favor and investigate two matters: a debunked conspiracy theory that Ukraine, not Russia, had interfered in the 2016 election, and the business dealings of Hunter Biden, the son of his political rival, Joe Biden. At the time, the Trump administration was withholding nearly $400 million in military aid that Congress had approved for Ukraine to defend itself against Russian aggression. The House of Representatives launched an inquiry, hearing testimony from diplomats and national security officials who described a pressure campaign orchestrated by the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, to force Ukraine to announce the investigations. The House charged Trump with 2 articles of impeachment: abuse of power, for using his office to solicit foreign interference in an election for personal political gain, and obstruction of Congress, for refusing to comply with subpoenas for documents and testimony. In February 2020, the Republican-controlled Senate acquitted him on both charges. The second impeachment came with stunning speed in the final days of his first term. On January 6, 2021, following a rally where Trump told his supporters to fight like hell, a mob stormed the U.S. Capitol in an attempt to stop the certification of the 2020 election results. The attack left multiple people dead and sent lawmakers fleeing for safety. 1 week later, the House of Representatives voted to impeach Trump for a second time, charging him with a single article: incitement of insurrection. They argued that his repeated and false claims of a stolen election, culminating in his speech on January 6, had directly provoked the violence. His Senate trial took place after he had already left office. 10 Republican senators joined every Democrat in voting to convict him, making it the most bipartisan impeachment vote in American history. However, the 57-43 majority fell short of the 2/3 threshold required for conviction, and he was once again acquitted. Throughout these proceedings and numerous other investigations, Trump and his allies maintained that he was the victim of a politically motivated vendetta by a permanent Washington deep state that had never accepted his legitimacy. They argued the actions he took were within his authority as president and that the investigations were baseless attempts to overturn the will of the voters. His critics argued that his conduct represented a profound threat to the rule of law and the foundations of democracy. They saw a pattern of behavior that placed personal interest above national interest, showed contempt for the separation of powers, and culminated in an unprecedented assault on the peaceful transfer of power. These dramatic political battles were not isolated events. They were symptoms of a deeper and more fundamental realignment in American politics, one that was both driven and embodied by Trump himself. His ultimate impact cannot be fully understood without examining how he took a major political party and permanently remade it in his own image. Conclusion: the Trump legacy, a permanent reconfiguration? So, what has Trump done? After examining the economy, the borders, the courts, and the world stage, a picture emerges, not of a temporary political shift, but of a fundamental and perhaps permanent reconfiguration of American politics and policy. To his supporters, he was a restorer, a transformative leader who broke through a corrupt and stagnant consensus to put America first. To his critics, he was a wrecking ball, a demagogue who shattered democratic norms and damaged the nation's standing at home and abroad. The facts, stripped of the fury, reveal the sheer scale of the disruption. In the economy, he delivered a brand of economic populism previously unseen in modern republicanism. He fused massive tax cuts for corporations with a protectionist trade policy that tore up decades of free trade orthodoxy. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the renegotiation of NAFTA into the USMCA, and the sustained trade war with China were not just policies. They were a declaration that the era of globalization was over, to be replaced by a new era of economic nationalism. On immigration, he did more than build a wall. He erected an entire administrative barrier, using executive power to choke off asylum, separate families, and launch a mass deportation effort. The fight over the border was a fight over national identity, and Trump's actions drew the lines more starkly than ever before. In the judiciary, he achieved a quiet revolution. By appointing 3 Supreme Court justices and over 200 federal judges in his first term, he cemented a conservative judicial philosophy that will shape American law for a generation. For many of his voters, this was his single greatest and most lasting accomplishment. On the world stage, he was the great disruptor. He challenged allies, engaged adversaries, and withdrew from the international agreements that formed the bedrock of the post-war order. His transactional, America First, foreign policy questioned the very premise of the U.S. as the indispensable nation, forever altering how the world views America and how Americans view their role in it. He unleashed an engine of deregulation against the administrative state, rolling back environmental protections and government oversight in a fervent belief that it would unleash the private sector. This culminated in the audacious and unprecedented move to dismantle a cabinet-level department. Perhaps most profoundly, he conquered and remade the Republican Party. The party of George W. Bush, of free trade and internationalism, ceased to exist. In its place rose a party refashioned in Trump's own image, populist, nationalist, and defined by an unwavering loyalty to him and the "Make America Great Again" movement. The full impact of these actions, the soaring national debt, the transformed judiciary, the hardened borders, the strained alliances, the heightened political polarization, will continue to unfold for decades. This book has not sought to judge these actions but to document them, to provide a factual answer to the foundational question. What has Trump done? He has fundamentally altered his party, the nation's economy, its relationship with the world, and the very nature of the American presidency. The ultimate verdict on whether these actions constituted a necessary restoration or a destructive rampage is now for history and the American people to decide.